a Dram and a Drash, where the water of life meets the tree of life. It's so good to be back with you this month, and I am delighted to be introducing this month's guest, Rabbi Jen Gubitz. Rabbi Jen is in the Boston area, not too far from where I am. She works at Temple Shalom of Newton. She is the co-host of her own podcast, the OMfG podcast, talking about all kinds of things Jewish. And she is also the founder of Modern Jewish Couples, which is a resource for young couples who are looking at creating life together, commitment, marriage, and providing resources to deepen and strengthen those relationships. So let's go over to this month's A Dram and a Drash with Rabbi Jen Gubitz. So Jen, welcome to A Dram and a Drash. It is so good to have you. I've been looking forward to this, and we're going to take a slightly different direction to the first few episodes I've had of season 1, which have been focused on individual whiskeys when we share a dram. What have you brought us this day? What are we drinking?
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I am drinking an old fashioned. There's a few things to know about it. It has Widow Jane straight bourbon whiskey. Honestly, because it's what we had open, I used orange bitters, which is important, a Luxardo cherry, and well shaken. And it's also being served in a glass from IU Bloomington bar, a bar that I went to a lot in college. And we used to steal the glasses when we were done with them. And when I went back as an adult, I said, I'd like to buy some glasses now. And they were like, no, it's okay. You can just take them. So the whole time we thought we were stealing, but we actually weren't.
So I have also the old-fashioned. I have what I've actually put in mine is rye whiskey. So it's interesting. We can talk a little bit about the whiskeys that we put in. I have used a variety of ryes. The one that I happen to have open is Sagamore rye, which is one of my favorites. And I love it also because Sagamore does a range, but their basic rye whiskey is not only delicious, it's also incredibly reasonably priced. You don't always have to spend a lot of money to get a really good whiskey.
That's awesome.
And also I have to say, I'm so pleased you mentioned the orange bitters, because a lot of old fashions talk about Angostura bitters, but they also talk about maybe putting in an orange or a little piece of orange peel. Mine doesn't have orange peel in it because I don't have any oranges in the house at the moment. I do have my maraschino cherry, but I get that little bit of the orange essence from the bitters. So how did you get to old-fashioned being a drink you enjoy, and why do you make it the way you do? Tell us a little bit about it.
I don't remember the first time that I decided I wanted to drink an old-fashioned. It was certainly not in rabbinical school. It was in my adulthood. Part of it was that I would always go to restaurants and end up with really sweet drinks, and I just don't like to consume sugar like that flavor. And then I think Thanksgiving 2014, we were in New Orleans where my family lives, and I went to a restaurant called Shaya, and they had Earl Grey old fashions. I happen to love Earl Grey tea. It was bourbon infused with tea. And so then my job at Thanksgiving was to be on drinks. So I recreated it pretty well, and got into like infusing, low key different flavors of tea into bourbon. And that sort of became my drink. And I would always try other drinks when I was out. I'll drink a Moscow Mule, but I would always find that they were too sweet. And so the orange bitters edition, though, on July 1, I think 2020, we were out to celebrate my husband's new job and I think eating outside for the first time in the pandemic. And we went to a taqueria, our favorite taqueria in JP, called Casa Verde. And I said to the waiter, like, can you make an old fashioned? Is that a weird thing to order here? Because I hadn't had a real nicely mixed drink in months because of being at home. And they brought one out and it was the best one I'd ever had. And I said, like, what is in this? And they said orange bitters and a really good bartender who can do more than margaritas. So that's become my drink.
Wow, that's wonderful. And yes, you get that little bit of the orange in there. I also have a little bit of a pandemic related story. I was not a cocktail maker at all until the pandemic came along. And then sometimes we do, like what do you miss and how can you create it? And I really just got the ingredients in the house for two cocktails: the old-fashioned, whiskey-based old-fashioned, and a dirty martini. Those were the two things that I missed being able to order going out, and so decided I'll make those. And one of the sort of dangerous things that happened was that our local liquor store had a deal for a particular bourbon they were offering at the time. It was a Hirsch bourbon, very nice, but it came with a free jar of the Luxardo maraschino cherries. Now, to give you a sense, like, I don't drink cocktails an awful lot. This is the free jar. I think I'm down to the last 3 cherries in here, but that's pretty good going. This is a really expensive jar of cherries, I've discovered. So, but I've been spoiled now that I've had these. It really does make a difference. What
you can't go
if
back
you're going to put a cherry in?
You can't go back to the neon orange magenta ones. I think that there was, if I recall right, there was a maraschino cherry factory in Brooklyn that was having some issues, and a lot of the bees, I think, was it maraschino? I think they were turning red. We'll have to check this, see if you want to include it. I think they were turning red because of the food coloring from those yucky maraschino cherries that taste great on ice cream sundaes. But Luxardo are the best, and that was a good free gift.
I didn't realize how generous it was until I was realizing I was almost out and going, I should buy another jar of that. And then I looked around and went oh, wow. Yeah.
It's really expensive.
It's actually kind of more expensive than the rye whiskey, I think, that I put in the cocktail, but it lasts a lot longer. Tell me a little bit more about the infusing the bourbon with tea, because I've watched programs where I see cocktail masters doing unbelievable things, fat washed bourbons, all kinds of phrases that, it's art and it's chemistry and that's way beyond anything that I personally have done. So, so you're already a step up there. Tell me about infusing bourbon with tea.
Pretty basic. I took Earl Grey tea bags and put bourbon in a bowl or a mason jar and put the tea bags in and sort of waited to see what happened. And that's it.
It was that simple.
I don't do science or cooking really. So this was about as basic as you can get. And it turned out pretty well. If I hadn't had the inspiration, I don't think I would have thought to do it, but very basic. You too can brew Earl Grey bourbon.
Sounds like I probably can. Have you ever had an old fashioned with anything other than bourbon?
So I've had them with rye. I've had them with whiskey. I was officiating a wedding a couple weeks ago, and I thought I'd ask if they could do an old fashioned at the cocktail hour bar, which usually they can't. They don't usually have the right stuff, or they'll pour orange juice in it or something like that. And the guy was using sweet vermouth. And I was very suspect because I've had so many bad old fashions, even though it's a basic cocktail. And he could see my hesitance, and he was like, try it. If you don't like it, I'll give you something else, which is fine. Let me buy you a free drink. Right. And so it was delicious. And I don't know why. I shouldn't have assumed that he didn't know what he was doing. My experience with cocktail receptions at weddings is that it's pretty basic usually. But it was actually really nice. I think it took the place of the simple syrup.
Yes. Yeah,
I think.
So I was asking because I've certainly seen that kind of variation, and there's so many variations on the sort of the basic ingredients. I did a little bit of homework just to look at the history of the old fashioned. Where did it come from? And as with all of these things, when they've been around for a long time, the history is somewhat contested. It seems as though certainly from the early 1800s, there was something called an old fashioned, but because of what was around and available at that time, seems to be that some of the earliest old fashions were being made with rum, with brandy, with gin, and the whiskey version comes maybe a little bit later down the line, towards the later part of the 1800s, 1880s. And of course, Louisville, Kentucky likes to lay claim to lots of things as being the first that's a bourbon old fashioned. And from there, the barman who had laid claim to it, brought it to New York City, and so it takes off. But yeah, and of course, different parts of the country in the 1800s, if rye was growing well, they would make rye whiskey. If corn was growing well, they would make bourbon whiskey, and so different parts of the country, you find that they tend to have different ingredients. I personally like the little bit of extra spice that comes with the rye, because I also don't like a sweet cocktail, and so I tend to aim that way. But I put a few things behind me of some of the things that I've used. One of the things that I do like to do is, which I didn't do with the Sagamore, is sometimes I'll use a bottled in bond, which means bottled in bond means a bunch of things. It's being distilled in one season in one distillery. It's bottled at 100 proof. So particularly if you're adding ice, it means that you're not watering down your alcohol too much, if you kind of like that. And I noticed this just came out. This actually, Whiskey Advocate called this their #1 whiskey of the year. Jack Daniel's now has a bonded whiskey, which I've tasted. I think a review for another time, but I've got a couple of those different kinds up there. And then let's talk a little bit about the ice. I don't know, what did you do with yours? What temperature? And what do you have in the glass there?
So I learned a lot also in the pandemic about icing drinks. We went to a birthday party, like an Airbnb Zoom birthday party, where they had a bartender from England teaching us different cocktail skills. And it's so basic, but icing the whiskey first in a silver shaker really brings down the temperature and makes it so much more delicious. But then you pour it out, you strain it. You do not use the old ice, I learned. I was, up until the pandemic, I was using old ice. But you then get, I have square cubes in the freezer. I don't mind it with, smaller cubes if that's all that's possible. But the square cubes are nice. And you can really tell at restaurants how good their bar is based on their ice cubes.
Yes, you can. Yes, you can. That's always the question I ask when they ask me how I want to drink is, how do your ice cubes come? And if they say it's a big chunk, then I know I'm in safe hands. So that was something also that during the pandemic I wanted to replicate. And I know there's so many different molds and so many different ways you could do it. What I ended up with, and I'll just show this because I'm not selling anything. I don't even remember the brand of this one. But actually it says on the outside, Tavolu. This is how you make a globe. And you get multiple molds. These stack, and you just fill them with, I use distilled water, not distilled, filtered water from the fridge, and you push it on, let the extra water, and just stick it in the freezer, and then you just sort of soak it on the outside with sort of slightly off cool water, and it loosens the globe from the edge, and it just drops out. So I've got a great big globe in there, and yes, I've come to appreciate that. There's something about the fact that you can have that temperature lowered, but not dilute it. But when you've got smaller pieces of ice, it dissolves much more quickly, and then you just get a very watery drink. And this is something that will last me the rest of this podcast quite easily. So let's shift gears a little bit. We've talked about a dram, and it's been delightful, and I'm really enjoying my old fashioned. So thank you for making this the drink of this month.
Thank you. Nothing like an excuse to drink at 4:19 on a Monday.
Yes, I'll say l'chaim to that. So this is a little bit of a corny segue, but forgive me. The old fashioned has a long history. It's an old drink, but it's become new. There's different ways of working with it, different kinds of infusions, all kind of people are doing amazing things with traditional drinks, and making the old accessible, relevant, intriguing to a new generation is really, I would say, maybe the essence of what you do. Some of what I associate you with as a rabbi. You are taking the wisdom of our very old Jewish tradition, and you are finding a way to connect to a new generation. You've spent a lot of time in your rabbinate really working with young adults. And tell us a little bit about sort of what you have gleaned, maybe if there are sort of key things that from working with that population you have gleaned about what they're looking for, and what our tradition has to offer a new generation that perhaps isn't interested in Judaism the way it looked for their parents or their grandparents, but are interested.
Well, first, that wasn't corny. That was beautiful. So thank you for likening my career to an old-fashioned, and seeing the work that I do and helping to frame it that way, because I think that's what I aspire to do. And so I appreciate being seen that way. The work that I started out as like doing teen engagement. You know, I was 29 in my first job, and then I went to the big city of Boston to do young adult work. And the truth is that my experience with teens and my experience with young adults, you know, folks who are 20s and 30s or maybe college age, and also my experience with adults of all ages, is that people are seeking authenticity, accessibility, trying to find a frame to bring Judaism into their modern life, and don't want to be treated like children, even though they might actually not have stepped foot into a Jewish space since they were a child. And they also want the experience to be really relational, and also to be high quality. So that's, I think, what the Torah is, right? It's relational, it's high quality, it's authentic, and there's so much wisdom in it. And for many of our lives, we search in other places. You know, we go to yoga, which is awesome. I go to yoga. We try all of these other practices. We find spiritual practice on Peloton. Me too, although it really hurts my butt, but you get the point. But we have it all right in our own tradition, right? And so part of that is just peeling it back, and also showing folks, bringing it to them, bringing it also to them, right? To the bar, to the cafe. I'm running an event in a library, you know, to the cultural shul downtown. And saying to them also, like, it's okay if you're not sure what you believe, or if you're sure that you don't believe in God, we still want you here. It's okay if you're Jew curious. It's okay if you're Jew adjacent. If you want to describe yourself as Jewish or bagel Jewish or whatever, great, bring it. Because I think that we've inherited a lot of guilt, we Jews. And sometimes I feel like, even though that's not what rabbis do, we don't absolve people of guilt. By bringing Judaism to a modern audience, in some ways we're showing them, like, you can access it from where you are and who you are. You don't have to be someone else in order to obtain wisdom.
What do you think it is about the way that, I don't know, Judaism is sort of more traditionally packaged or appears, that makes that something that isn't immediately obvious, where we actually have to sort of think about how we make that contact in a different way? There's, you know, that you talked about, you know, the yoga studios and Peloton. I mean, nobody's sitting there scratching their heads going, I mean, yoga's an ancient tradition, right? And there's been so many ways that people have accessed it, so many different kinds of yoga. You know, I don't know enough, but I don't get the impression, at least from the outside, that there's infighting in the yoga world as to whose version is more authentic or real, right? There's just a lot of different modalities that are out there. I always feel that as much as I probably could say a lot of the same things that you've just said about the work I try and do in a congregational setting, which is a congregation for all generations, like, I have a PR issue. There's something about the emphasis of the traditional congregation that's a barrier that gets in the way. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do think that it's a PR issue. I think that's part of it. I also think that when we work in congregations, and I do, that we can get bogged down in the details and the rules and the framework that we've created to serve a lot of people. And then that can be just complex for people who want more choice. I love Hebrew, and I love Hebrew singing. I love Jewish music. And I think that even if you went to Spain and didn't speak Spanish, you could get by in English. But there's something about folks who come into a Jewish space and immediately feel like they don't know 50% of what's going on because it's in Hebrew. And maybe the melody will trigger a memory if it's familiar. But my sense is that some people just feel completely alienated by it. And not because there's something wrong with Hebrew, but because they feel like they should know it and they don't. And so I think that's like the major boundary. And also this sense of, am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? Am I Jewish enough? And somehow they're getting messages, or we're sending messages that cause them to question their authenticity.
So are there things that you're doing? You talked about the different spaces, finding people where they're at. So going into sort of more neutral spaces, cultural spaces, and the work is very relational. So I assume that in order for you to communicate a different message, it's a lot of one-on-one conversations. It's about actually meeting this individual, that individual, and engaging them in a conversation. Is that sort of some of the pathways that you get people to sort of open up to more, or is there other ways in which the kinds of programs and activities that you make available to people sort of lends themselves to, opening those doorways for people?
So there's a few ways that it happens. Sometimes people come to us as clergy, right? And say like, I don't feel whole. I don't feel like how I want to be my best self, or I feel like I work all the time. We serve people that are busy, 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 and we live in a society that expects us to produce, produce, produce. And what can I do? Nothing's working. And then if I start to say like, well, how do you spend Friday, Saturday, Sunday running errands? Okay, well, do you like wine? Yes. If they can't drink, I'm like, do you like grape juice? Yes. Do you like challah? And they're like, of course. What do you mean? Of course I do. And then I ask them, like, do you have candles at home? And maybe they'll say, yeah, but it's mistletoe fragranced or pumpkin spice. And I'm like, I don't care what it smells like. I don't even care if you have a challah, a croissant, use it. If that's what you got, use the croissant. Take 5 minutes and breathe. That's Shabbat. And I see people say like, oh, I didn't realize it was that easy. I thought I had to set the table, and I thought I had to do the prayers right, and I thought I had to do all these things that I just can't get. I can't barely get dinner on the table with my schedule. And so bringing those sort of distinctive Jewish understandings to them, like they want to rest, but framing it in a Jewish way helps them to understand that like they both deserve it and they're frankly obligated to rest. And I always say to them, like, if you think you're so busy, like even God took a day off, like you can too. And even if they don't believe in God, they usually are like, okay, I get it, Rabbi.
Right. Yeah. And so there's the work you're doing that engages people with sort of some of the spiritual practice of Judaism and some of the wisdom that really is useful for life. And then there's another piece of the work you're doing that's explicitly with young couples, people who are committing to life together. And Jewish spiritual wisdom, we live at a time where we're aware that a lot of people, when they get married, they're not always going to their places of worship. They're not going to clergy. They may never have had a relationship there, or it may have been many years. And yet there's still important work to be done in the spiritual side of committing to live together with someone, to make a life together with someone. And I know that's something you've invested a lot of thought into. Tell me a little bit about how you got into that work, and what are you doing with young couples?
Awesome. Yeah. So Modern Jewish Couples, I founded it on July 1st, 2021. And it came from my years of experience of a few things. Couples coming to me with a 7-day-old baby saying, we know we're supposed to do something tomorrow, or, they were about to give birth. They hadn't discussed Jewish rituals of welcoming a baby. They had assumptions. Maybe they weren't both Jewish, so they had different assumptions. And I wondered, who did your wedding? Did you talk about these things? And often they had a friend or a wise loved one officiate. And I got curious about that, and I started to see it in the New York Times wedding announcements as well, which is, some people celebrate Havdalah on Saturday night. I read the New York Times wedding announcements. And I saw that, in fact, people were having their weddings officiated by people ordained with the Universal Life Church, but also the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, which I thought was funny. But I was curious, and I found a study. It's not it doesn't cover all of Jewish population, but it was a study that showed that 60% of a sample of interviewees of interfaith couples, 60% of interfaith couples were not having clergy do their weddings. And like you said, there's so many reasons why they wouldn't, right? They don't know someone, it's been a long time, they don't feel religious, they don't affiliate, they're interfaith, they're not sure if the rabbi will say yes. And so I think that ship has sailed, as much as I wish that suddenly all the rabbis ever could do all the weddings, but I think that ship has sailed. And so I wanted to make sure that those people had premarital counseling. And I wanted to make sure that their officiants knew what they were doing, besides just, downloading a script off the internet and trying to personalize it. Like, what does it mean to really support couples through this transformational moment? And so that's why I created Modern Jewish Couples, because I felt like sometimes even if people did have clergy do their weddings, they hadn't had essential conversations. And I just thought, like, we have a 50% divorce rate. Could that be one of the reasons why, which is that we have a romanticized version and understanding of marriage, and we don't pursue difficult conversations with our beloved? And so that was why I wanted to build this project, which does premarital counseling privately, in cohorts, on couples retreats, trains officiants, and runs a lot of wedding education, so that even if you've decided to go outside the rabbinic system, you still have access to good wisdom.
Yeah, I think that that's so important, that often the conversation among some of our colleagues is limited to, as you said, couples presenting who they are, what they're looking for, and the clergy is making an assessment either, yes, I can say yes to this and I will work with this couple, or I won't. And it's this, zero sum, as opposed to all of those other things that go along or should go along with preparing a couple for life together. The pre-marriage conversations and even just conceiving of what they're doing as something that has holiness to it. And that's something I think I feel very strongly about that. And again, sometimes you have to unpack that, because holiness doesn't necessarily mean one very specific idea of God. It can mean so much more. So tell me a little bit about how you infuse some of the spiritual with people who perhaps have not thought about that in the context of the life they're living together.
So one thing I do want to say just about when rabbis say no, which is that sometimes, like, shout out to rabbis, they have a family vacation planned, or, they have to be at a family event for their own, like, loved ones, and sometimes often people choose wedding dates that are well before Shabbat ends, or even on a Jewish holiday they don't know about, like Tisha B'Av or Slichot. So I know that our colleagues use more discretion than like yes or no. But when we get to these couples, so one of the things, so when you said holiness, I was like, oh yeah, I like felt the word. And that word has been obscured from sight for many young people today. When they hear the word holy, and I've done this exercise with numerous groups of couples, they think of things like the Pope. Sometimes someone who's snarky will say cheese or a bagel, but they're thinking of things that are unattainable. And we have to really unpack what holiness means. And so one of the ways that I help them do that is by giving them different choices of what they can say to each other under the chuppah wedding canopy. They don't have to say, I make you holy or I consecrate you, because those words are not words they use regularly and have never said to their spouse before. You could argue that this is the one moment where it's so holy that they should, but for many of them, they want to say something that feels true. And so I love Sarah Bareilles, who just got engaged. Way to go, Sarah. And she has a song called I Choose You. And that's what I have my couples say if they want to. I choose you with this ring, which is, I think, a modern day synonym to I make you holy. I consecrate you. And so by bringing, I literally call her, I joke with couples that she's Rabbi Sarah Bareilles, and bring in that wisdom, because I think it's a really rich piece of poetry. And I would use Rumi, so why not Sarah Bareilles?
Yeah. That's absolutely resonates with me. And actually, it's so simple right? I choose you. One of the
Yeah.
things that I struggle with, because when I'm talking to couples, I'll talk about how I look at the etymology of kadosh, and I'm talking about, we have lots of relationships, our parents, our siblings, our friends, and really what this word is about is that the relationship I have with you is distinct and unique and special.
Yes.
It's compared to all of those others. I'm setting this apart to be different in quality to those other relationships. Not that I don't have these other relationships, and that kind of they hear that and go like, oh right, yes, but that's not a neat little phrase to put into a ring exchange. That's a very long-winded way to try and get at the essence of what we're talking
I
about.
designate you as holier and more special than my relationship to my mom sometimes.
Right. It's like, but I choose you. That's a very simple way of getting to the essence. Yeah. I was also thinking about what you said, I wanted to also be clear, right? This is not a conversation that's about, what rabbis don't do or can't do.
Not at all.
It's just recognizing the reality of a much broader landscape that's out there. And I was saying the same thing. I'm not judging rabbis who can't say yes to certain things, just simply putting the thought in our heads that not saying yes to a specific day or a particular kind of ceremony doesn't have to mean not saying yes to spending time working with a couple.
That's also true.
And that's something that I've thought about. It's not always what couples want. They want an ongoing relationship with someone that's going to culminate with the event itself, and they're entitled to choose that. But to at least make that offering, which is all about coming back to what you talked about before, which is about the relational work that we do in order to open doorways. We're facilitators of connecting people with a spiritual wisdom that is really, it's only useful and meaningful if they find that it serves a need, that it serves something that they're looking for. You talked about Shabbat being, a really good example. How many people are just thirsting for that moment to take a breath, and being shown that there's a way to do that without being overwhelmed by the idea of having to make a 3-course meal for, which is not the easiest way to start. Yes. Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about young couples and the work that you do, and some of what they're looking for, and the spiritual wisdom that we can share in a lot of different ways and different places. I didn't prepare you for this particular question, so it's a little bit putting you on the spot. But if you were to think about maybe one or two things that come from our tradition that you have just seen people like light up, like that is something so proud. Thank you for bringing this to us. Thank you for giving me a way to understand something in a way that really transformed their sense of being. Is there anything in particular that you'd point to that has really spoken to people that you've worked with in that way?
Yeah, I love that question. So my first thought was a few pieces of liturgy. So I believe so deeply in the power of communal singing. I was raised up as a song leader at URJ Goldman Union Camp Gucci in Zionsville, where all we did was sing all day. And if it rained more, we sang more because we couldn't go outside. And there was always something about tefillah, time praying together or singing together. I'm sure different people had different experiences of it. And from that experience growing up, singing, my family also sings a lot. Religious school tefillah is actually, so I work part-time running a B mitzvah program at Temple Shalom of Newton. And religious school tefillah is my favorite part of the week, which is not a thing most rabbis say. I know. And people are like, that feels crazy. What do you mean? And for me, on Sunday mornings, especially when we have parents and kids, I've started to use music that has Hebrew, but has English translations that feel like a hug, a real hug. So like we will sing Dan Nichols' Asher Yatzar, which is our bathroom blessing, thanking God that all of our pipes work. But his lyrics say, I'm perfect the way I am and a little broken too. And I can't think of any other message that people need to hear every week, for every day, every second, about getting through the world. And I see families sitting with their children. We invite them to hug themselves at this moment or to pat their heart. And they say to me also, it's 9:30 in the morning. I'm not a morning person. I'm drinking my coffee on the bima, bad rabbinic behavior, but I have to. And I see them warm up and loosen and settle in. And they have told me how much that time means to them. We're singing a mix of secular and Hebrew songs, a lot of music by Noah Aronson, a lot of movement with our bodies, and a lot of time to offer gratitude. And I think, again, I'm translating it like in the way that I was taught as a song leader, to translate it to people so that they can access the music. We're not getting up there singing any classical reform melodies or singing at them, we're singing with them. And so that's the first piece that I think can be transformative, is bringing liturgy to people. Hashkivenu, praying for shelter of peace, a sukkah of shalom, is also, I think, a prayer that I have seen be transformative for people. And the second piece is Musar. I have done some work for the Musar Institute and have been trained as a Musar facilitator for a long time. And it's the practice and study of Musar, which is our spiritual and ethical tradition of personal refinement of character traits through Jewish wisdom, which it's always a hard word to describe. But Musar essentially is like, how do I be my best self? And how can Judaism help me? And this study and practice have transformed how I teach, because ultimately Musar shows you that there's no right or wrong. There's just a middle path. And you're always trying to move yourself to the center if the center is the right place to be at a given moment. And so I think that can be really good for self-management, right? When you're impatient, Musar teaches you how to manage your patience. When you're feeling ungrateful, it teaches you how to manage your gratitude. When you're running late, it shows you that actually you need to be more honorable to the people to whom you are arriving late. And it helps you get a better sense of how much space you take up in the world. So those are my sort of two leading modalities of ways to reach people right now is accessible singing and Musar practice.
Thank you. I think those are two beautiful examples, also because they illustrate, I think, two different approaches that sort of coming at things from different ends. So, you've got something which is the structure of, ritual gathering, which is, has, and how to translate that into something that can connect to life, and finding a way to interpret and translate some of those core prayer moments of our tradition in a way that people can really feel in their bodies and experience as being something that they deeply know inside of themselves. And then on the other side, taking something which is about the observation of just being, of, the daily version of you, and adding something that sort of lifts that self-awareness to a higher level. It's Jewish mindfulness practice, it's
yes.
And I think so often people see Judaism through the lens just of the structures, just of the festivals and the rituals and the prayers and the blessings. And, and they look to other traditions to find those sort of daily mindfulness practices. And it's right there in
Absolutely.
our tradition as well, just as you beautifully expressed.
It's right there. And I think, so one of the things about I could sit in an Orthodox synagogue and be happy too, if I needed to. So I love sort of the keva of prayer, the things we're supposed to do because we do them, even if they're unfamiliar. I feel comfortable being in settings where I don't know what's going on. But the kavanah, the intention, is what's so malleable. And I realized when I was, 10 years ago doing tefillah, religious school tefillah, that Larry Hoffman had taught us about the structure of prayer. Praise, petition, thanks, right? That's what it is. But then those words don't necessarily work in modern parlance.
Mm-hmm.
And then I read Anne Lamott's book, Help, Thanks, Wow. Anne Lamott is a Christian writer, I would say a liturgist in some cases, coupled with some Mary Oliver poetry. And I'm like, oh, Jewish prayer is help, thanks, wow. Or during the pandemic, it was gratitude, healing, and memory. And bringing things like our ancient rabbis did, on three things the world stands, bringing the tradition to these very like concrete and accessible ways of engaging were actually really transformative for me personally. When I realized, like, what do I need? Like when rabbis are leading, like, what do you get? Sometimes you get a lot, sometimes you don't. Depends what you put in. Depends if your guitar's in tune, like all those things to think about. And I realized at certain points, all I needed was help, thanks, wow, or gratitude and healing and memory. And so I think that's what people need. I don't think people are going to read liturgy books. They need us to tell them essentially the Twitter version, the 140 characters or less of what and how to pursue connection with that which is greater than us or themselves or gratitude, practice, things like that. But yeah, we have it all right in our tradition with a little help from our friends.
Right. And of course, yes, for those who want to, they can go further. There's depth, there's layer upon layer upon layer.
Yes.
The wonderful thing about our tradition is that it is so multi-layered. It can go on and on and on. But first of all, you have to be pulled in, drawn into something where there's that spark, that light that goes off, where you go, that's what I need, or that's where I am at, or you just connected with, that's how I felt, and you said the right words, or you gave me a way to just sit and notice what's going on with me today and what I'm feeling.
And it can't be like a hard eagle pose, right? Like no one goes to yoga and does a headstand for the first time. Right. It can't be unattainable right off the bat. It has to really be, accessible.
Yeah. So I would, for, the people who might be listening from a variety of different places, wherever you are, there are rabbis who are having these conversations. There are places where you can go and people are doing this kind of work. If you're in the Boston area, go find Jen, but also connect with some of the communities that are doing work like this, because this is the richness of the tradition, and we're just looking for these different ways to open those doors. And this podcast, of course, is just one of the many ways where it might open a door for someone who might have started with the Dram, and I hope also gets to appreciate some of what we have shared together in the Drash in our conversation today with Jen Gubitz, Rabbi Jen Gubitz. Thank you so much for joining me and for sharing a really delicious old-fashioned. I want to say l'chaim, and thank you again.
You are bringing us the tasting notes of the richness of Jewish life. So thank you for having me, and it was great fun.
Thank you for that. L'chaim, take care. Well, thank you for joining me for this episode with Rabbi Jen Gubitz. All of the information regarding her projects you'll find in the credits at the end of this episode and in the notes. If you're looking at the notes that go with the audio version of this podcast, you can find me at my website, rabbirg.com. And please do be in touch with your comments and feedback, ideas for guests. And if you want to propose yourself as a guest, I'd love to hear from you. That's how we found a couple of our guests who are coming up in the months ahead. And for right now, I want to just wish you all well and l'chaim.